we begin the second session on historical inquiry, and I want to recapitulate what we did in the last one by way of exploring a question that the wheeled suitcase with telescopic handle did not exist forever. And this is the thing that we tried to see, that if we have to counter such a steady state theory, as I may call it now, that if somebody believes that it has been there forever and it did not emerge at a particular time, then the way to convince somebody is to fish out convincing evidence for that. We have to convincingly show someone that there was on a timeline a point when something did not exist before that particular time, and it came about on a certain stage. And that is why we can show that it has not existed forever. So that was the first point that we wanted to talk about. Then we went into one of the major preoccupations of a historical inquiry that is to evaluate the evidence. How do we look at the evidence? And the evidences we considered were oral testimony, media report in that particular context, documents, and there could be archaeological resources, there could be inscription, there could be numismatics, and all kinds of things depending upon what is the question that we are exploring. And we list out all these evidences, and then what we do is to check the reliability of that evidence. That if that evidence that we are calling for, justifying the claim that wheeled suitcase existed sometime, began to exist at a particular point of time, if the evidence is reliable or not. And this is needed to evaluate and rule out or minimize the possibilities of error. Thus, the evidence becomes more and more reliable. And we also saw that in one context, that what are the ways in which the possibilities of errors are supposed to be creeping in, and that is the instrument that we use. And we tried to explain to you that if we say that a particular time something begins, and there are ways in which how do you calculate that time. So say, for example, if the carbon-14 dating is being invoked, then that is the instrument, and if there is an error in the instrument, then there will be, so that error has to be ruled out. Similarly, the process that we adopt, what is the object of study that we do, that we are looking at, what is the magnitude, and what is the purpose. And we went into it all in some detail in the previous session. And so we, for example, we looked at that when we are looking at some kind of a marriage purposes, we are only happy that if the boy is slightly taller than the girl, we are not getting into the millimeters and centimeters. But when it is we are looking at the door frame, then we are looking at the millimeters and centimeters so that it is fitting into perfectly. So that purpose is important, and magnitude is also important. So when we are, say, for example, calculating the distance from the earth to the sun, there will be an admissible error. So the range of the admissible error would be larger, or could be larger. For example, when we are looking at some dates in the modern times, we would not only talk about the dates, but we can even go and talk about the specific time that something may have come about. But as we go behind, say, for example, in the prehistoric times, we would be admitting hundreds of years as some kind of a margin of error that will be admissible to us. So we talk that it was in 3rd century or 4th century, or even thousands of years kind of thing can be taken into account when we go further and we try to investigate, say, for example, some geological history. So that is the magnitude and the purpose, and therefore what is the kind of what are the ways in which the possibilities of error that comes in, that we investigated. And we ended up by talking about the corroboration from the independent pieces of evidence to increase the robustness of the claim that we are trying to make. And so we are not going by one piece of evidence, we are looking for number of other independent evidences to come together and corroborate each other, and then we see that a convergence of evidence is taking place. The more the convergence takes place, the greater the robustness of the same thing happens. What we are also concerned about, which I will just mention in passing, is that historians generally, and I am talking of the mainstream historian, and I consider myself to be one of them, trying to wean away myself from the mainstream history, there is not much of an awareness for what is called counter-evidence. What we are looking for is what psychologists would call confirmation bias. We are looking at those kind of evidences that support our theory, our general presuppositions, and we would kind of ignore if it is not fitting into our larger framework. What is our, now the inquiry prerequisite is that we are looking for even the counter-evidences, because the counter-evidence helps you fine-tune the theoretical propositions that you are trying to make, and we would like to be as precise, as concise, and as accurate, so that the predictions from the theory could be tested out later on also. Now we go on to the next part, and today I will be trying to pick up something from the distant past. Before I do that, I want to ask you something, that do we think that past and history are coterminous? That past is history. The past and history are the same thing.
History is recorded past.
Study of past. It is not past. That the textbooks that we read, they present as if that is the past. That is what happened. So the first thing, and very quick kind of thing that we need to see, is that the past is the object of investigation. And history is the claims about the past, and these claims are arrived at by considering the grounds that are available in present. The grounds are available in present. I have deliberately used just the claims here because the conventional history that is being taught to us in the schools are a set of claims that are presented as history, where the historical inquiry, from the inquiry point of view, differs from it, is that this claim has to be a justified claim. And this is what is not always done. Our students are only given, and that is, there is a baggage that is required for it. The purpose of history is essentially the purpose of indoctrinating. The moment you are not going for a justified claim, then you want somebody to believe in certain kind of claims. You simply want them to believe. You don't want them to question those beliefs. So if I say that Ashoka was a great and non-violent ruler, and he had great compassion, then I'm kind of not giving you any evidence that goes firstly contrary to this claim, or even the evidence that proves this claim. On what basis do you say that? And you probably, in some of the new textbooks that have come, you cite one instance or one evidence, but you don't take the rigor by which you are trying to question the evidence, first of all, by interrogating the evidence, first of all, and you simply take it straight away, a kind of conclusion that you are committed to draw. You see this kind of a thing happening, where there are historians who are out to prove that Saraswati River existed. And they are going with a belief. And that belief has to be substantiated by some such kind of a mumbo-jumbo that they create. And they would go and they will dig up the place and they will say that here is this Saraswati. You have got no reason, no ground. You are not given any justification that, you go and dig up any place, you will get the water, right? I mean, at some distance or some larger distance. You would, but how do you know that this water that is coming from this particular digging is from Saraswati? That is not being asked, because suddenly you will be told that this is a matter of faith. And the faith cannot be interrogated by reason. That is the kind of a history that is being taught. So history as a tool of...
Is this two things? I think I had earlier question about your bias.
Yes.
Most historians are not questioning what you said, looking at counterexamples. Is that?
Yes.
And is this universal about all historians? Or is
I would say that this is a general trend.
General trend.
There are historians who are aware of that, some of them, but then the rigor with which some kind of a historical propositions have to be stated is lacking. It's stated in some kind of a general form, and that generality about stating a theory has an assumption that history is a science which is inexact science, and therefore predictions are not possible, and therefore the rigor in theory will be not required. I mean, rigor in theory is required only when you are committed to the proposition that if there is a theoretical proposition, any prediction emanating from that theory can be tested. And they said that these cannot be tested, and there is a whole baggage of traditional baggage that we carry with ourselves. Another point about history is that history has always been, this indoctrination has a tradition where history is presented as a tool of legitimization. So, if you see ancient kings, the ancient kings would claim that they belong to Chandravansh or Suryavansh. Nobody knows Chandravansh or Suryavansh, the lineage traced from moon or the lineage traced from the sun. What is the reason for this tracing the lineage from moon or sun? You couldn't have been born from moon or from sun. This is, quite pedestrian kind of a logic. But then the requirement for doing such thing is that to present themselves as somebody distinct from someone else. This lineage is the part of history, and history presented as a mythology, and they kind of merge together, and you are trying to looking for justification. This, if you understand, and this is not some point that I am going to dwell upon, but I just want to drop this thing to you, that this precisely is the reason that history as a justification, history as indoctrination, that you see the kind of struggles that are happening on the history textbooks. Every new political predisposition that would come would like to change the history to suit their political ideology. History is a tool of justification.
A very small check for understanding that suggests that make sure that I'm on the same page as a group. You said like Ashoka was a great ruler and very compassionate. This is a claim which has been made, and this claim would require justification based on the evidences available in the present.
Yeah.
So can you give a brief example, like how could someone like either justify this claim or prove it?
You see, normally those kind of claims are justified by presenting to you some kind of an excerpt from the Ashokan edicts. There are rock edicts, minor, major rock edicts that survive from the time of Ashoka. They are purportedly belong to, they have been issued by Ashoka himself, and therefore you can take that this must have been Ashoka. You go into the very, very interesting and intriguing and very meticulous kind of research that historians do at the back end, is that, say for example, Ashoka, it was for very long time, even before the edicts came into being, nobody knew who this edict belongs to, because it does not mention the name Ashoka. It says Devanam Piyadasi. These are the two words. So this edict has been issued by somebody who is called Devanam Piya, one who is loved by God, and Piyadasi, which means that somebody who is who has benevolent eye for everybody. He is very compassionate. He is very large-hearted. Who is this large-hearted person? Who is this person who is kind of Devanam Piya? And one source in Sri Lanka directly pointed out to this, that Ashoka is being called Devanam Piya Piyadasi, and then after that followed a whole series of investigations, and then there were other evidences that were called for, and they converged, and thus we are today convinced that those rock edicts belong to Ashoka. In those rock edicts, you see that Ashoka appeals to the Brahmanas, the Shramanas, and everybody that you should be living in compassion. Fine, I am being told yes. So tell me. I mean, we can talk about that later, but
Yeah, can it be seen like every current government or current governance framework
yeah.
prefers to develop their own theory and tries to force fit past data and interprets those theories using abductive reasoning to claim that that is it? Is that a fair summarization of
Yeah,
adopted in history?
there is no, there are a set of beliefs, and the history is kind of fitted into that framework of belief. That belief needs to be substantiated through theory. You see the interesting part, I'll take just 1 minute on this, when they say that the aeroplanes existed in the ancient India. And last Science Congress, there were a whole host of scientists who went and they said that aeroplanes existed in ancient India. What is the evidence that they are providing? They are once again taking resort of the scientific method of proving that yes, it was there. And they would say that, look, this is mentioned in some kind of a document which belongs to earlier period, and that document is taken as a anecdotal evidence, unsubstantiated evidence. There are no other corroborative evidence, and you are being told like that. So this is a faith, this is a political ideology. That ideology needs to be legitimized, needs to be supported by history. That is supposed to be, non-ideological, and you know that this is how it has to be done. I am repeatedly told this idea of mine to go into all kinds of things. Please. So this is one small one-pager that I want you to see. This is a by the time you read, I will.
We need some more. Yeah.
Okay, so this is one pager, and I hope that you will find it. It is evident that there is a teacher, conventional teacher, who is trying to dialogue with a student who is probably little sharper than the teacher. Can I have one copy? Any copy left out there? So any thoughts and any comments quickly about this dialogue? There are one of the things that I was pointing out to is the claims that are being made. A whole set of claims that are being made here in this dialogue by the teacher. When he tries to explain Neolithic revolution, then he is assigning causality to the emergence of agriculture. First of all, he says that agriculture emerges at some certain point of time, and then he assigns causality to the agriculture in the settlement of the people. People became sedentary. So earlier the hunter-gatherers were nomadic, they were moving about. With the agriculture they became settled. The population grew. There was the emergence of specialized crafts. People came up, so there were potters, there were carpenters and all that. Those who could live without getting engaged in the primary production, that is growing crops and all that. That led to trade, that led to urbanization, that led to state and all that. These are all set of claims that are being presented. What our students are supposed to write is reproduce these claims in the examination when they are being asked. What is Neolithic revolution? They would say that Neolithic revolution is the time when agriculture emerged and it led to all these kind of things. There are lots of questions that are involved in this dialogue. We are going to take up only a few of them, or rather one of them. What I want to say is that, firstly, notice, and many of you who were concerned about the content kind of a thing, that was not coming. What is the point in talking about the suitcase with wheel? That today, that what we are going to do is that there was a time when suitcase with wheel with telescopic handle did not exist, and there was a time when agriculture did not exist, are not two different kind of questions. These are the conjectures, parallel conjectures I would say, that we are committed to provide rational justification for that. And we are trying to explore the ways in which we can go about providing the rational justification for these two claims. And the inquiry method of looking into history differs from the conventional method of history as an indoctrination, is where it has to be rationally justified. Now, let's go one by one, and we look at that. In order to prove this conjecture that and find out a rational justification for that, I'm trying to simplify a bit, but still it is there that for this we need to have a definition of what is agriculture, what we call agriculture. Two is that we have to have a background assumption or a theoretical construct that will help us building our argument. In this dialogue that you saw, there is very interesting contrast that the child is trying to present. He is asking, when the agriculture is there, he is asking that today why the peasants are committing suicide. And the teacher comes up and he says that, look, this is, I am talking of 12,000 BCE, and the present thing does not matter. When it comes to what is agriculture, then he says that, don't you see, it's happening all over around. And the child points out that, look, these are two contradictory things that you are saying. If the first claim is correct, that you cannot have a parallel between past and present, then the agriculture must be taking place in some different way. So the grains must be growing upside down. It's possible, right? Or if you invoke, this is what we call the theoretical proposition that we subscribe to, the background assumption that we subscribe to is known as uniformity principle. So we know that human beings are born in a certain kind of a manner. That we know that the plants and other the cereals grow in a certain manner, and if they grow today, they must be growing the same way in the past. This is our background assumption. This is the background assumption of, say for example, the evolutionary theory that Darwin also presented, that this uniformity theory is correct. We assume this to be correct. We are not going to give proofs for that. That is our background assumption. After having done that, we have to find out and we have to dig out and look for other sources, other evidence to substantiate this claim and to create that kind of a justification. Those evidences firstly will have to be checked for their reliability. There is a convergence of evidence that will have to be done, and then a whole theoretical framework of justification will have to be worked, step by step reasoning, how they are connected to each other, and then we look for a justified theory. This justified theory that I am trying to tell you is only justified theory for me because I haven't tested with my peer. So there is a Sriram or there is Vaidish or anybody, Jeevan, and these are my peer historians. Now I present my theory on the basis of this evidence that I have collected and the background assumptions that are there and the other evidences that I am marshalling in order to create this theoretical proposition. I am presenting before my fellow historians, and those fellow historians are free to question any one of these things. So they are free to ask me for the background assumption and validity of my background assumption to begin with. They can ask about the reliability of certain kind of evidences that I am presenting before them, and they can say that no, I don't think that the reliability is enough. So when the fellow historians are, say for example, examining the claim that the aeroplane existed, then they are asking them, where is the prerequisite? What kind of an aeroplane was it? And you know that in ancient India, the kind of aeroplane that existed was a miraculous aeroplane. It could make 90-degree turn in the air there itself while flying. So you will have to ask for the prerequisites, you will have to ask for evidences, more evidences than just citing one facsimile. The dates you will have to ask for evidences, more evidences than just citing one facsimile, the date of which is another problem that you will have to decide. How do you know that this facsimile comes from that particular date? And it's a very engaging, very interesting and long-drawn process. So to give you just a quick example of that the Vedas were basically oral tradition. It did not get written till very late. I mean, 5th, 6th century is the time when historians assume that it got written. And then Pune is a place where the critical edition of Vedas was created in the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Library, where all the facsimiles of Vedas were called for from different parts of the country, and wherever they found it, and then this reliability check was done, this corroboration was done, and what they created is called the critical edition of the Vedas, which is now considered to be an authentic source. We call that, this is what it is. Okay. So the only thing that we have to do today is to find out I am limiting my role to the definition of agriculture. What is agriculture? Can I have some, this is a kind of silly question that I am asking, but asking silly question is an important criteria for good scientists as well. I am being a kind of a humble historian, so and especially during the first half I am very, very humble. So what is agriculture? Can we just quick 2-3 takes and then we will go on.
Controlled production of food.
Okay. So we are trying to define agriculture and we say controlled production of food. Controlled production of food. And food, say for example, today was fried idli, and it was produced in a very controlled kind of a situation. So that is agriculture.
Make it raw food.
Raw food, okay. All right. Anybody else? Any other definition? Yes, Anuradha.
The method of tilling or
Method of
tilling
tilling.
or using soil or the land to benefit or produce
Yes,
crops.
crops. Okay, one more. Yes,
Mass production or mass cultivation of plants,
mass,
cultivation of a single kind of plant.
any other thing that you want to add?
Maybe answer your question.
No, I am not going to ask question. What we are trying to do is that we are trying to how to construct a definition. You have given me three definitions, and we will try to look for the way in which this definition can be brought into the realm of correct definition.
Bagish?
And
Sorry.
Yes. Agriculture would also mean rearing of animals. Would it only be
Agriculture will mean rearing of animals.
it would be part of agriculture.
Also,
Yeah.
Also,
Do you?
along with crop, it would also be like.
No, but that is. There are two things, no. Rearing of animal and agriculture are not two things.
I thought you are guessing it.
What you are saying is that they are same things.
Agriculture includes animal husbandry
Including
and
animal husbandry also. One of these two are true.
Does it assume the last one that both of them would have happened at the same time? Or both of them are supposed to be happening at the same time? Or is there some kind of a time lag between these two? Okay, cereal.
some may not.
Before we go into that, and if I may ask you to draw your attention to this dialogue, this child is raising a question, serious question. He is asking that when you say that agriculture begins at a particular point of time, say that this is a timeline, and you say that agriculture begins at time A, you have to say that there was nothing, the agriculture did not exist in time, should I say minus A? And when it did not exist, so here is agriculture, and it did not exist here, so what was the way in which they were, so how the hunter-gatherers lived by? They lived by hunting and gathering. There are two words that are mentioned all the time, and the gathering means what? Picking up fruits, roots, leaves, grains as well, no? So any wild grain that is there is also included in gathering. Now if the wild grain is included in gathering, the child asks that what could have led to agriculture? What do you call it agriculture? In agriculture you don't create something new. This whole process of the production of plant can take place without human intervention. Has been taking place without human intervention. That is what is called wild. The plants are growing in nature, and they are naturally growing. So what happens in agriculture? What are the new traits that come up? What you call that this is wild and this is agriculture. This is wild and this is cultivated. You know, that he is calling for that kind of an explanation. And we need to have some kind of a rudimentary idea. Only then our definition will be kind of checked with that. So let's see that what we call wild and what we call agriculture. You don't want to say about wild, you don't say. But then agriculture will have to be understood in terms of wild better. So I call it wild and I call it cultivated. The grains are, whether it is wheat or corn or barley or any such thing, that mind you that in the nature there are thousands of species that exist even today. But human beings picked up only some selected 2 dozens, a little more than 2 dozen kind of species of the grains to domesticate or to cultivate. Similar thing happened with the animals. There are many animals that are still wild and they have not been domesticated, they have not been, the animal husband, they have not become the part of the animal husbandry. We are not getting into that kind of a scenario right now. We are just trying to find out some traits of cultivated and some traits of wild, so that we can check that the definition that we are coming up with matches with those traits. What are the traits of cultivated? Can I have some controlled production? This calls for explanation, and this is a general word. As I tried to point out, production means production of dahi vada as well, right? So you are basically trying for. So can we fine tune this one? But before that, can we take some other? Yes, please.
In cultivated, there was a concept of storage of grain.
Okay.
There was a certainty that you will get. Wild may, it's a possibility you may not.
No, that is what is evident from the dialogue also, that if there is certainty, then why are farmers get suicide?
Yes, I'll come to that, but let me, yes.
Can we refine the word controlled with systematic or scientific?
Okay. Let me go for some more certainty of produce.
Meant for human consumption.
No, if I kind of see this, only controlled production is not what is not happening here. My point is that storage of grain isn't the wild grain can all, they can also be stored. So is this a new trait that is emerging with agriculture? The wild can also be stored and they are still being stored. So shall we put that in a question mark, or shall we cut that out, because that does not differentiate agriculture from the wild? 2, certainty of the produce is what the dialogue questions. That is what he is asking. That if agriculture led to those many great and revolutionary changes within quotes that you are citing, then what is happening to the agriculturalists today? Why the certainty is not coming? Yes.
About the storage business.
Yes.
Suppose we separate the two parts. If there is storage of products, then we call it agriculture. Or if there is no storage of agriculture, we don't call it agriculture. Which way is it?
Yes. This is a very interesting
Sufficient
question.
condition versus necessary condition.
Okay. Just I'll come to you, sir.
There is also storage.
And now there is a different interpretation of storage has come, and we will have to quickly look at that. But let me take his points.
Same thing, it just.
Same thing. Okay.
Storage
So
of grains with seeds. You have to think about future. So I guess cultivation means you are keeping them as seeds.
all right.
In cultivator, there is like human intervention.
Human intervention.
You are taking care of plants or animals.
Like planned and initiated by human beings or something.
Okay. Human intervention. In wild, things are happening on their own. Cultivated will happen only when there is a human intervention. Yes. And here also we calls for finer defining of that. Yes, Vagesh.
Enhancing natural process.
Yeah.
Altering.
It could be altering natural.
Altering.
Huh?
You can say altering.
Enhancing stroke altering natural process. Now we have I have been given a strict warning about the time, so I am trying to keep up with the time. I
Do
will.
all these things happen in wild also?
Which one?
certainty, human intervention, how would they appear in wild?
Okay, I'll take all of them one by one. Let me pick up the one that I had erased, and Mohanan raised a question about that. So I erased, Mohanan raised, and I put it back. Storage of grains. How do we know that the way, do we assume that the wild, when we say, then we are meaning hunter-gatherers? And this is farmers. We have to assume that storage was not taking place in the hunting-gathering period, that they were not concerned about storing certain kind of grains that would be useful, that can be stored. First of all, storage calls for all kinds of grains cannot be stored. There are only certain kind of grains will have that have the storage abilities. Was there any difference, firstly, that if there was a storage or not? I would say, for the time being, you have to accept. Can I put a few more then? But let me go on this first, and then I'll add a few more from my side. So, the historians found out that the storage is not so-called endemic to the farmers. There are certain kind of things that even hunter-gatherers store for some time. They may not store for it for the next season, maybe. Yes, Tara?
No, actually on storage, Vijay added something. He said storage of grains for seed.
Okay.
For future use.
So, the grains for seed, grains for eating, can that separate it? The purpose of storage? These are two purposes. Hunter-gatherers are also storing certain kind of dry fruits. And the Kung Bushmen of Kalahari deserts, they were studied, and it was found that the kind of dry fruits that were available to them, and they were easily storing them. The important shift that takes place, and I don't want to give away from some kind of a theoretical propositions that it comes, because it calls for justification further, and I must be committed to my own commitment that justifications will have to be provided, but we are talking of a very complex kind of a thing. One of the things that they found is that there was a difference in the nature of the storage. And two differences were there. One is that the hunting-gathering storage is taking place in such a way that storage will have to be mobile, because they are not staying in any particular place. So they are storing, but they are storing in some kind of a skin maybe. So there is something that they can carry on their backs, and if they are going to the next location, then they can use that thing. This is one important. Whereas if you look at the settled people, that is cultivated, those who are practicing cultivation, they were necessarily settled people. That is what we haven't proved it, but for the time being, let's assume that this is true. For the reason that cultivation takes place at least 3 months' time. You have to take care of that. You have to be there, otherwise there are all kinds of things that will destroy. So at least for 3-4 months you have to stay and take care of your food. The other part is that function of the storage are different. So here the storage comes in the form of static storage. There comes the role of pottery. You have different kinds of potteries that are coming here in which you can store that. The potteries are meant for, even in villages you can see that there are mitti ka long this thing that they make, and they store different kinds of grains out there. Two is that the purpose of storage for you to be used as a seed next year is very important. Now that the ghanti has been rung, I want to tell you is that human intervention, therefore, and altering and enhancing the natural processes all will require a very detailed examination. What do we mean by altering? If the moment you say altering, you have to say altering from what? There has to be a virgin, the notion of virgin, only then you can understand altering. Just as you have to have a notion of wild, only then you can understand the cultivated. Therefore, you have to have a notion of virgin, or there is another word that historians and archaeologists use, is that natural habitat. You have to have a notion of natural habitat, and from that natural habitat, interfering with the natural habitat, that you will have to construct that, yes, that natural habitat has been altered or done something with, and these two are linked that way. The human intervention is taking place. Now, what is the nature of human intervention? That is something else that we will have to see. Let me quickly now, there are certain things that I'll have to be giving it to you. So, one of the major changes that takes place from the wild and cultivated is this, that all the wild plants have the propensity of falling down once they are ripe, because that is important part of their natural reproduction. If they do not fall down, they will not reproduce themselves. So if you see any any wild plant even today, they will fall down and they will create that kind of the cycle of natural reproduction keeps on going. What is also defined as cultivated is that the difference between the wild and the cultivated is this, that there are genetic and morphological changes that are taking place in the grain, in the nature of the grain. To give you one simple, two examples of those kind of cultivation, is this, that the corn that we eat today, the cob which has 20 to 25 rows that you find, if you look at the wild corn, then it had 3 to 4 grains only on it. And the wild corn grows only at the top of the tree, the plant. While in the process of the artificial selection, and I'm sorry for using this word when I have not explained it to you, but let me invoke the common sense understanding of it, that there are a number of wild varieties of a grain. The wild wild corn has a very hard upper surface, and at times some of them are bitter also. Now, human beings, in the course of their hunting-gathering period, they found that there are certain species which are more tasty. Certain species which, say for example, in the barley, you have bigger variety. The wild barleys are bigger. If the grain size is bigger, then it has the propensity of falling down, and that is useful for, say for example, the wild thing. They did not like that. They wanted those kind of varieties that will not fall down from the stem. So they chose the smaller variety of barley. And thus those kind of grains, so they chose that, and then they kept the best of the seeds, and then they kept on doing that. So through this process of artificial selection, there was change that was brought about in the morphology and the genetic changes that were brought about. So to give you just one example, is that the wild grain contains 4% of sugar and about 26% of protein. Whereas the cultivated, and particularly this American corn that we are eating from the malls, it contains 40% of sugar and 6% of protein in the best of them, even less than that. So that kind of a morphological and genetic changes that took place, and that is taken for the cultivated. So when you find something like this, which is away from the away from the wild, changed those changes have taken place where the grains are not falling. Necessarily, it is important that when you are harvesting, grain should not fall. You should take it to your place, and then you beat it, and then the grain comes out. This is the process. These are the kind of morphological genetic changes that took place because of the human intervention. But what is the human intervention? That we will have to see. And how do we find the kind of human intervention? Let me quickly also tell that the method of tilling that one of you said will require that you are asking for certain kind of technology. Method of tilling, to me, means some kind of a technology. So say for example, if they are using plough, that will be a method of tilling. Is that what it means?
Yes.
Yeah? So you want to say that unless and until they have started using plough, a certain kind of technology, I will not accept this to be agriculture. One is that. But in that, there would be other methods of doing the same kind of a thing. What is the controlled production that it means? What is the human intervention that we mean? What is the altering of the natural processes that we mean? In order to know that, what historians have to resort, and I'm citing one source, and I want your attention to that, is the anthropological studies. Of the study of those kind of tribes or those kind of hunting-gathering people who are still practicing the rudimentary agricultural practices or non-agricultural practices. And I am giving you some 8 very selected samples of 8 case studies of different kinds of agriculture or the control or intervention that they are doing. Will we call intervention? While this is being distributed, let me also tell you is that this intervention that you are talking about is not only being done by the human beings. What about the birds and crows which feed on these kind of grains and they go fly away to different kind of places and have their droppings? Thus, they are altering. The things are being taken away from the natural habitat and they are going into a different kind of an habitat. Will that constitute altering? There are animals which eat certain kind of foods and their droppings are going to fall at some other place. The mobility of animal is little less than the birds. The birds are going to do like that. There are still certain kind of plants which cannot be grown by human beings without going through the gut of the birds. So, for example, you wouldn't see, or it would be difficult for you to grow people. You go and find out any of the peepal tree that you see, that there are no saplings coming down under below. Hardly. At the same time, you could see some kind of a dilapidated house where the plants, you see plants growing. Isn't that intriguing? The seeds are falling down in hordes. There are no plants, and there is no possibility how does seed go there, and that it has to go pass through the gut of the birds, only then it becomes germinable. So the interventions are of different types that are taking place. Will we call only human intervention? So this definition will call for finalizing what our agriculture should be. How do we understand what exactly is agriculture? So I have given you some examples that last example, and then I want you to see a small video clip.
Do you want us to read this now or later?
They can read it now.
Do we need time to show it? Yeah.
There is no time to read it, so
Either reading or video, not both. Video.
I have to close with the video because that is something that will augment the reading. So reading is something that they can do later on. The data that I have presented falls in 4 broader categories. One is where they are using the product of the plant. Okay, so the carders are taking certain kind of fruits from a particular plant. They are making a powder out of it and throwing around in the water that intoxicate the fishes, and they go and catch the fish. Will you call the human intervention? And so on and so forth. There are first two examples are of that. The later examples are what they call generalized hunting. Hunter-gatherer's life is very clearly linked with the seasonal growth of various kinds of things. They knew each and every plant growing, how they grow. And then you see that how and I have kind of presented in kind of a series where you can see that how generalized hunting-gathering grows into what is called specialized hunting-gathering, what further grows into the husbandry of the tamed resources. These are the names. And then you see selective breeding of the targeted resources. This is the kind of a thing. The video that I am going to show is to ask you a question that do you think that only human beings did agriculture? The definition that we are only halfway through, that we are halfway through and we have not even halfway through, we have not even properly begun to construct the definition, should take into account the anthropological study that I have shared with you and this particular thing, and you decide what is agriculture.
Most tropical plants are permeated with toxic chemicals, a deterrent against browsers. The ants cut fresh vegetation, but they don't eat it. They feed it to another organism. Foragers carry their cargo down into the nest and turn it over to smaller worker ants. They clean the leaf fragments and chew them into a pulpy mulch. Leaf cutters cultivate a fungus that breaks down the toxins in the leaves and swells with proteins and sugars. This is the ant. Are dependent on each other for food. Ants eat the fungus. This will take away the fungus and they'll die. Reverse, the fungus can actually eat ants. Just Amateur colony where ants consist of as many as 8 million individuals, and they're the dominant herbivores of the New World tropics. They take
Vagish has to move away from there.
a mature colony of atoms.
Vagish, your microphone has to move away from there.
The equivalent of an adult mouse sitting in the middle of the rainforest, foraging on the vegetation in their immediate area. The entire rainforest is affected by the symbiosis of fungus.
You can't keep both mics.
To understand how it evolved, Schultz and Mueller collect ant nests throughout Latin America. An experienced eye can spot the subtle signs of a young nest, founded perhaps 6 months ago when a new queen left home with a bit of fungus in her mouth and burrowed into the ground. Opening a nest is a very exciting moment. Suddenly the cavity opens and you see a fungus in it. And then you may see the queen. There's a the size of the peanut. What we've learned from studying the ants is that you can have a long-term existence, over 50 million years as an agriculturist. There's clear parallels between the ant agriculture and human agriculture. Both types of societies are dependent on cultivation of some other organism and have very sophisticated procedures how to promote the growth of these organisms. But human farmers are plagued by pests in their crops, while the ants' gardens seemed pest-free. A century of research had concluded that the ants are probably so adept at weeding that no infestation can take hold. A graduate student in 1998, Cameron Curry, just didn't right. I actually had some people tell me that looking at diseases in the ant gardens was kind of a silly project, that the ants may keep the gardens free of diseases, and so why would you be going there to look for diseases? So I went out and collected ant colonies and then I isolated pieces of the garden to see what was there other than the fungus the ants cultivated. He cultured 1,500 fungus samples, and the same aggressive mold kept showing up. When he removed the ants from the nest, he saw the mold devastate the fungus in a matter of days. So the ants did have a pest in their gardens. But how did it keep it so completely under control? Cameron began to wonder about a white waxy coating on the body parts of some ants. What really intrigued him were the ants working deep in the gardens that were covered with the stuff. He asked the experts about it.
In the past, I just considered this to be some sort of nondescript secretion that was produced by the ants for unknown, probably uninteresting reasons.
And Cameron was the first to put this waxy secretion under the microscope and notice it was not inert, lifeless. It was actually alive. The wax turned out to be tangled mats of bacteria. But what shocked him was these were the same types of bacteria that produce half the antibiotics used in human medicine.
I remember my graduate advisor and I were laughing, thinking that wouldn't this be exciting if these ants have been effectively using these bacteria for production of antibiotics for millions of years, when humans only discovered this 60 years ago, and we thought at the time that this was maybe a bit far-fetched.
Far-fetched, but true. It seems the ants have been using antibiotics to control the pest in the gardens for some 50 million years. So why hasn't the mold evolved antibiotic resistance?
I think that the answer probably lies in the fact that the ants are using cultures of millions of cells of bacteria to produce these antibiotics. And so these bacteria are evolving. Likewise, pathogen that is the target of these antibiotics is also evolving. And it's an evolutionary arms race that has continued for 50 million years.
And so the symbiosis of ant and fungus also includes the aggressive mold in the fungus garden and the bacteria living on the ants. Nature is often more complex than it first appears. Scientists have just begun understanding.
So, this video is available on YouTube called Leaf Cutter Ant, and you can see that how this fungus cultivation is consciously being done by the ants, and with that constitute agriculture. Last bit of information, that so far a belief or not, justified belief held by historians and archaeologists for about 60 years now is that the agriculture began, the first earliest example or earliest evidence of agriculture came not before 12,000 BC, has been questioned 3 months ago, where the archaeologists have found a place near Israel, western Israel or southern Israel, and they are now dating the agriculture back by further 11,000 years, and they claim that the agriculture began in 23,000 BC. Now, why I give you this example is that any theory that is being presented is liable to change in the light of new evidence. That is what happens in any science. And for us, history is no less a science. Thank you.
Or perhaps science is history.
No, that means